Since the last episode, President Donald Trump, his wife, his son, and several other attendees at the Rose Garden event where Amy Coney Barrett was announced as Trump's Supreme Court pick tested positive for COVID-19. Soon after his diagnosis, Trump was back to his duties and ready to continue his campaign trail. There has been great discussion, if we'd like to call it that, between the two presidential candidates about COVID-19, their responses to it, and how it has impacted American life today. Before I jump into today's episode, I wanted to take a moment to say thank you to our listeners for choosing New Age Politics as your news source and allowing me to continue doing what I love. Thank you. On today's episode, we will be talking about COVID-19 and the government's response to it. Since we're now in the midst of the presidential election, I think it's an important topic for us to be discussing, especially for those listeners that haven't casted their votes yet. Before we really start getting into it, I'd like to mention that I haven't personally been affected that much by the virus. I haven't lost any loved ones. I was lucky enough to be able to keep my job. I hope that in discussing this, I don't come off as insensitive towards any of those that have. As we've seen in the last 10-ish months, the government has had quite a difficult time handling COVID-19, despite an early warning to prepare for its impact on a nation. I wanted to take a look at how they reacted, good or bad, to the virus though, and discuss how I think they should go forward in approaching it. I think they've had an interesting mix, to say the least, of policies, including those with influence from socialism, but I do believe that these policies have been motivated by capitalist ideologies. The actions taken by the government have been truly damaging to the well-being of the country, and we definitely need reform in our response to the virus. I think my personal politics definitely play a role in my analysis of the government's response. I grew up in a single-parent household as a family of all girls. I think I might have talked about this in an earlier episode when I invited, it was Abigail Schreier on, I think that's who it was. As I got older, I definitely saw the effects of sexism and misogyny in American society. Neither of my parents had a college degree, yet it was a lot easier for my dad to get jobs and make more money compared to my mom. They're both hardworking, but I think their respective genders definitely affected their opportunities in life. I think a lot of this does come from the fact that we live in a patriarchal society. There's a long history of oppression of women, and it comes from how our society's been built. This reminds me a lot of this one theorist, philosopher, whatever you would like to label her, Simone de Beauvoir. She had a similar belief that men and women are unequal in the eyes of society. She talks about how this comes from men categorizing women as the other and excluding and opposing them to men, and also the poor transfers of power. Another philosopher that I also think resonates with me a lot is John Rawls, who focused more on equality as a whole than Simone de Beauvoir. He believed that every person should have the most extensive basic liberties compatible with the system of liberty for all. He also discussed the idea that social and economic inequalities should be of the greatest benefit to the least advantaged and open to all for equality of opportunity. Since I did grow up in a poor single-parent household and I was a little darker than the kids I went to school with, I was able to experience inequality firsthand. It definitely has impacted myself and how I view political issues, which is why I wanted to bring it up before I dive deeper into the government's response to COVID-19. While there have been multiple attempts to respond to the poor economic state of the nation, there has been one notable action that the government took. In the spring of 2020, Congress approved a $2 trillion stimulus package that included a $1,200 stimulus check that was sent out to taxpayers across the country. The government also provided emergency relief for American workers and small businesses. The idea behind the stimulus checks and relief provided by the government is often attributed to socialist ideologies. Since the stimulus checks were limited to more lower-income households, many consider this as the government putting the means back into the hands of the workers. While the intent behind the government's actions seemed to be helping the struggling American, this is little of what we actually saw. After the government released the stimulus aid earlier in the year, there has been a failure by the government to further provide for struggling Americans. Millions of Americans became unemployed and small businesses had to shut down. Big corporations have been able to benefit largely from the pandemic, while small businesses have struggled. Jeff Cox states that loans to smaller businesses have been slow to get out, but the central bank has been buying junk bonds and debt of big companies like Apple and Microsoft. The way the pandemic has been dealt with has resulted in a possible K-shaped recovery, where the poor stay poor while the rich get richer, resulting in greater inequality. First, let's take a look at what Heather Bushey, author of Finding Time, The Economics of Work-Life Conflict, has to say about the pandemic.
But this crisis and the crisis of care that has ensued, with schools closed, with daycares closed, with families being unable to find ways to care for children and for others while they have to work, this is really going to make it hard for millions of women and other caregivers to fully participate in the labor market. And that's going to have an impact on family incomes.
Relating to what Heather had to say, I think that the poor response of the United States government, at least compared to other nations, has resulted in the harm of women and families' well-being across the nation. The inequality that previously existed between men and women is being further exacerbated by the handling of the pandemic. In August, the CDC published COVID hospitalizations and death by race and ethnicity. The data in the CDC report shows that Native, Black, and Hispanic people in the United States experience a significantly higher number of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths when compared to white people. When compared to white Americans, the number of cases for Native Americans was 2.8 times higher, with a hospitalization rate of 5.3 times higher. Black Americans experienced a death rate of over 2 times as high as that of white Americans. The impact on women and people of color being more greatly impacted by COVID shows that there is inequality issues with COVID-19 and the response to it. There needs to be a change in the response to the pandemic in order to fight against these inequalities that were worsened by the government's response. The issue, though, is that the United States has had problems with racial, gender, and economic inequality throughout its history. I believe that the government needs to adopt new policies since it has an obligation to protect our interests. An issue that has occurred with the pandemic and the government in general is the relationship between Americans and freedom. Americans' ability and willingness to comply with local ordinance is dependent on citizens' view of government and their relationship with it. This boils down to Americans' concept of liberty and freedom. Let's take a look at the lockdown protests that took place in Michigan. At the beginning of May, protesters assembled at the Capitol building demanding the reopening of businesses. Many protesters violated social distancing rules and mask requirements following the governor's stay-at-home extension. These protesters, among many in the nation, felt their negative liberty had been infringed upon. The concept and motivation to protest against a government failing to meet its citizens' needs, in this case their need to economically recover and live without restrictions, can be attributed to the ideas of Hobbes and Locke. Hobbes believed that citizens should give up some of their freedoms in exchange for protection from the government. Locke argued that power is desired from the consent of the governed, and people have the right to overthrow their government if it isn't meeting the interests of the people. I believe that it is important for us as citizens to maintain this relationship with the government, despite its ill effects in Michigan, because it allows us to have an impact and voice within the nation. I believe that it's in the best interest of the population if the United States adopted more socialist policies. I don't believe that the form of socialism desired by Karl Marx, also described as revolutionary socialism, would be the best form, though. Marx believed that a revolution was necessary in order to bring about change and equality, but I think many Americans would be opposed to drastic changes in the political system. I do believe it would be beneficial, though, if policies were gradually implemented that represented socialist ideologies, which emphasize cooperation, fellowship, compassion, and equality. Equality is a huge issue within our society, and it's been worsened by the government's response to the pandemic. In order to diminish the effects of it, we need to be voting for and demanding that the United States creates systemic equality even after the pandemic. This may include passing an equal rights amendment, criminal justice reform, a stronger welfare system, higher taxes possibly for the wealthy to protect against that K-shaped recovery I talked about earlier, and many other policies that make citizens equal. The United States government needs to do a better job at maintaining the harm principle, which states that only those actions that harm others, affecting them adversely, should be prevented by public opinion or the state. This will promote citizens' abilities to speak freely and act freely, as long as it's not causing harm to others. As previously mentioned, Beauvoir and Rawls have identified the presence of inequality within society, each within their own propositions on how to fix this problem. We may benefit from examining those solutions and demanding the government take action to change this, since their power is not legit without the consent of its citizens. That's us. Change needs to happen. Thank you for listening, and tune in next time with New Age Politics.